In 1965, a 23-year-old woman moved into a flooded house on a Caribbean island with a dolphin. She ate there. She slept there. She worked there. 22 inches of salt water on the floor, 7 days a week, no breaks, no days off. NASA was funding the whole thing. The goal? Teach the dolphin to speak English. What happened over the next 10 weeks would derail careers, spark a government scandal, and end with the dolphin apparently choosing to stop breathing. This is the week-by-week story of the strangest experiment the United States government ever bankrolled, and why no one involved ever wanted to talk about it again. To understand how any of this happened, you have to start with one man, John Cunningham Lilly. Lilly was a neuroscientist, brilliant, credentialed. He'd trained at Caltech and the University of Pennsylvania. By the late 1950s, he'd become obsessed with dolphin brains, and for good reason. A bottlenose dolphin's brain weighs roughly 1,700 grams. The average human brain, about 1,400. Lilly didn't think that was a coincidence. He believed dolphins possessed a form of intelligence we simply hadn't learned to access yet. In 1961, he published a book called Man and Dolphin. It made a bold claim that with enough effort, humans could learn to communicate with dolphins, and dolphins could learn to mimic human speech. The book became a sensation. Carl Sagan read it and saw implications for communicating with extraterrestrial life. NASA read it and started writing checks. By 1963, the space agency, along with the U.S. Navy, was funding Lilly's Communication Research Institute on the island of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The facility was called Dolphin Point Laboratory, and it was about to become one of the strangest places on Earth. Dolphin Point wasn't your typical research lab. Picture a villa overlooking the Caribbean Sea with indoor pools connected directly to the ocean. Inside were 3 bottlenose dolphins, 2 females named Sissy and Pamela, and a younger male named Peter. All 3 had been brought in from marine studios in Florida. They'd actually appeared on the television show Flipper. Peter was the youngest, energetic, curious, and according to researchers on site, remarkably responsive to human interaction. He wasn't the smartest of the 3, that distinction belonged to the older females. But Peter had something the others didn't. He was social in a way that felt almost human. He sought eye contact. He vocalized constantly. He seemed to want connection. Lilly noticed this immediately. And so, when a young local volunteer named Margaret Howe Lovat proposed an ambitious new phase of the experiment, Lilly paired her with Peter. The idea was radical, even by Lilly's standards. Margaret Howe Lovat was 23 years old. She wasn't a scientist. She was a naturalist, curious, self-taught, deeply interested in animal cognition. She'd volunteered at Lilly's lab and had already spent time with all 3 dolphins. But she had a theory. She believed the communication experiments were failing because researchers only spent a few hours a day with the dolphins. Language immersion, she argued, required total immersion. Think about how children learn to speak. They don't get 2-hour lessons. They're surrounded by language every waking moment. Margaret wanted to replicate that with Peter. Her proposal: flood a section of the lab with 18 inches of salt water and live inside it. Full time, no going home at night. She would sleep on a mattress elevated above the water, cook on a raised platform, and spend every moment of every day within arm's reach of Peter. Lilly approved it, and in the summer of 1965, Margaret moved in. The experiment was designed to last 2.5 months, 10 weeks. What followed would redefine every boundary she thought existed. The first days were chaos. Peter was overstimulated. He splashed constantly, rammed into furniture, and knocked equipment off the raised platforms. Margaret could barely sleep. Dolphins don't follow a human sleep cycle. Peter would vocalize at 3 in the morning, nudge her mattress, demand attention. But Margaret held firm. She started with basic phonetics. She would hold objects, a ball, a cloth, a brush, and repeat simple words slowly and clearly. Ball, ball, ball. And she recorded everything, every session, every vocalization Peter made. What she found, even in that first week, surprised her. Peter wasn't just clicking and whistling. He was attempting to shape his vocalizations into something that resembled human sounds. Dolphins produce sound through their blowholes, not their mouths. They don't have vocal cords in the way we do. But Peter was modulating his output, adjusting pitch, duration, and rhythm in ways that clearly mimicked Margaret's speech patterns. It was crude, barely recognizable, but it was imitation, and imitation is the first building block of language. By the 2nd and 3rd weeks, a routine had formed. Margaret spent 6 to 8 hours a day in structured lessons with Peter, and the rest of the time simply living alongside him, talking to him during meals, narrating her activities, reading aloud. The results were measurable. Recordings from this period show Peter producing sounds that approximate the cadence of short English words. Not perfect, not intelligible to a stranger, but consistent enough that Margaret could distinguish his attempts at different words. She was genuinely encouraged. But there was a problem developing. Peter was an adolescent male, and as the weeks passed, his sexual behavior intensified. He would rub against Margaret's legs. He would become aroused during lessons and refuse to focus. Sessions that had been productive were suddenly derailed by Peter's physical impulses. Margaret tried redirecting him. She tried ignoring the behavior. She tried separating herself on the raised platform. Nothing worked. Every time she re-entered the water, the cycle restarted. The experiment was stalling, and Margaret was faced with a decision that would follow her for the rest of her life. Margaret made a pragmatic choice. Rather than continuing to interrupt sessions, and rather than sending Peter back to the other pool, which would have ended the immersion experiment entirely, she began manually relieving Peter's sexual urges. In her own words, decades later, "It wasn't sexual on my part, sensuous perhaps. It would just happen. It was just easier to incorporate that and keep going." She framed it as a practical solution. The way she saw it, the interruptions were destroying weeks of progress, and the alternative, breaking cohabitation, would kill the entire study. So she treated it the way a researcher might treat any obstacle. She removed it, and here's what's remarkable: it worked. After Margaret began addressing Peter's needs, his focus returned. Lesson productivity went back up. Vocal mimicry improved. The bond between them deepened in a way that seemed to accelerate everything. But here's the thing: Margaret documented all of this in her official lab notes. Every detail. She filed them with Lily. She treated it as data. She had no idea that those notes would one day be published in the worst possible context. While Margaret was living with Peter upstairs, something very different was happening downstairs. John Lilly had discovered LSD. He'd been introduced to it at a Hollywood party in early 1964, reportedly by the wife of Ivan Tors, the producer of the original Flipper movie. And Lilly didn't just take it recreationally. He became consumed by it. He began using LSD in his sensory deprivation tanks, the isolation chambers he'd invented years earlier. He believed the drug could unlock new dimensions of consciousness, and then he made a leap that no ethical review board would ever approve. He started injecting the Dolphins with LSD. Sissy, Pamela, Peter, all three received doses. Lily wanted to see if the drug would break down the communication barrier, if a chemically altered dolphin mind might bridge the gap to human language faster. The results were inconclusive at best. The dolphins showed altered behavior, but nothing that resembled a communication breakthrough. What the LSD did accomplish, however, was destroying Lily's credibility with his funders. NASA officials were already uneasy about the direction of the research. When word of the LSD injections reached Washington, the clock started ticking. By 1966, the experiment was falling apart from every direction. Lily had become more interested in psychedelics than dolphins. Margaret's cohabitation study had ended after 10 weeks, and while her results were promising, they weren't the kind of headline-ready breakthrough that justifies government spending. Then the press got involved. An article appeared in Hustler magazine, not a scientific journal, not a newspaper, Hustler, titled Interspecies Sex. It dramatized Margaret's relationship with Peter into something unrecognizable. Overnight, the research went from obscure to infamous. NASA pulled funding completely. The U.S. Navy followed. The Communication Research Institute was shut down, and the three dolphins, Sissy, Pamela, and Peter, were transferred to a far smaller facility, a repurposed bank building in Miami. No ocean access, no sunlight, no open pools. Just cramped indoor tanks in a dark, windowless room. Margaret had no say in the transfer. She wasn't even informed until it was done. The last time she saw Peter was at Dolphin Point. She didn't get to say goodbye. Here is something most people don't know about dolphins. They are not automatic breathers. Humans breathe involuntarily. Your body does it whether you're conscious or not. Dolphins don't work that way. Every single breath a dolphin takes is a deliberate, conscious act. They choose to surface. They choose to inhale, which means, and this is the part that changes everything, they can also choose not to. Weeks after being transferred to the Miami facility, Peter's behavior changed dramatically. He stopped vocalizing. He stopped engaging with handlers. He floated listlessly in his small, dark tank. And then, according to Rick O'Barry, the dolphin trainer who had worked with the original Flipper, Peter sank to the bottom of his tank and simply did not come back up. He stopped breathing. John Lilly called it suicide. O'Barry agreed. "If life becomes too unbearable," O'Barry later said, "the dolphins just take a breath and sink to the bottom. It's a voluntary act." Peter died in late 1966. He was with a handler named Andy Williamson when it happened. Williamson said Peter looked him in the eye, took one final breath, and went under. He never surfaced again. Margaret Howe Lovett did not speak publicly about the experiment for nearly half a century. The Hustler article had turned her into a punchline. The scientific community distanced itself. Lilly spiraled further into psychedelic research and fringe science, eventually claiming he could communicate with extraterrestrial beings. He died in 2001. Margaret went on to live a quiet life in the Virgin Islands. She married. She raised a family. She never worked with dolphins again. Then in 2014, a BBC documentary called The Girl Who Talked to Dolphins tracked her down. And for the first time in almost 50 years, Margaret told her side of the story. She was composed, unapologetic. She described the experiment with the clinical detachment of someone who had always seen it as science, even the parts the world had turned into scandal. When asked about Peter, her composure cracked, just for a moment. She said the hardest part wasn't the ridicule. It wasn't the career damage. It was knowing that Peter had been taken somewhere dark and small, and that she hadn't been there when he needed her most. What happened at Dolphin Point Laboratory in 1965 was a lot of things at once. It was ambitious science. It was institutional hubris. It was a genuine attempt to bridge the gap between species. And it was a catastrophic failure of ethics that cost an animal its life. But maybe the most unsettling part isn't the LSD or the scandal or the funding collapse. Maybe it's this: Peter did learn, he mimicked, he adapted. He formed a bond so deep that when it was severed, he chose to stop living. And we still don't fully understand what that means. If this story made you think about consciousness, about the line between science and exploitation, about what we owe the creatures we study, leave a comment. Tell me what part hit you the hardest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now might be the time, because this channel goes places most won't.